Welcome to the American Humanist Association Critical Minds series. I'm Kristen Wintermute, the Director of Education. I'm excited to have with us this evening Sidewalk Science. Sidewalk Science is a twice monthly live and recorded YouTube broadcast presented by the Chicago area AHA chapter, the Prairie State Humanists, and a panel of experts from all over the country. Each program covers a bit of science news and then focuses on a deep dive topic chosen by one of their 6 regular panelists. They explore the intersection of science and humanism and advocate for the view that science is the best way to learn what is real and possible in the world, and that the results of scientific inquiry can help us create a more just, sustainable, and flourishing world for humanity. Tonight, their deep dive science topic is UFOs are all the rage. Without further ado, I welcome Sidewalk Science panelists. Thank you all for coming.
Hi there. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you to the AHA. You know, the AHA is a sponsor, a co-sponsor of our program run through the Prairie State Humanists. I invite all of you who are interested in tonight's program and the theme of scientific discussion and discovery to check out the meetup group for our local humanist chapter. You can find the Prairie State Humanists on meetup.com and that way you can be kept apprised of our schedule for Sidewalk Science, as well as other programs, many of which are focused on science. So our goal, as Kristen said, is to talk about science. We believe that science is wonderful and wondrous and has all kinds of fun things for people to learn, but it's also got practical applications in terms of helping us discover how we can improve the world and ourselves and what's real and possible. So we typically begin these kinds of meetings with a quick rundown of some science news that has interested our panelists. Before I get to that, I want to take this special opportunity, though, to have each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves, because for many of you, you probably haven't seen our YouTube channel for Sidewalk Science and haven't been to these meetings before. So I would like to take this moment to have each of our panelists take about, 30 seconds or so and introduce yourselves. I'll go first. I'm Scott Thompson. I have been giving public lectures about various scientific topics for many years. And my interests and largely self-education go all the way from astrophysics to biology and geology. I do have a physics degree, and I've done graduate work in physics and political science. And I'm happy to be here with you tonight. Let's move on to the order in which people show up on my screen here for our panelists. Joanne, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Joanne Reed. I'm a chemist by trade. My doctorate is in education, primarily in the fields of critical thinking and cognition. So I do brain, why do we think the stupid things that we think, and then we swear by them, and generally we're wrong. So next.
Okay, next would be John. John, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm John Doty. I'm a physicist. I primarily do scientific instrument design. Many of my designs are in space. You've probably heard of TESS, the current NASA Planet Finder. I designed the imaging electronics for that. My interests are mostly astronomical, but I'm interested in just whatever science can tell us.
All right, thank you, John. Sorry, it took me a second there to find my mute button. Next on my screen here is Abby. Abby, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Abby Hafer, and I'm a public speaker and writer. largely on biological issues and where biology intersects with education and public policy. I've got a doctorate in zoology, and I currently teach human anatomy and physiology.
Thank you, Abby. Next is Mike Albro.
Hi, you hear me? Yeah. So my name is Mike Albro. I got a PhD in particle physics experiments over half a century ago in the UK. And since then, I was a professor at Stockholm University, but I've been 30 years in the US working at Fermilab on experiments, helping discover the top quark here at Fermilab and later the Higgs boson at CERN. I retired officially 4 years ago, but I'm still doing this stuff because I'm addicted to it and working on projects at the Large Hadron Collider. And meanwhile, trying to be more of a science writer and doing some science writing as well and talking. Okay, that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And then the final person showing up from our panel on my screen is Ivan Phillips. Ivan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ivan Phillips. I got my PhD in theoretical physics long ago. My thesis was on the topic of detecting differences between matter and antimatter colliders. Since then, I've been involved in science outreach and critical thinking, and I recently published a book on rationality and why we should be teaching it in schools.
Excellent. Okay, thank you all. So let's now start with our regular program. We'll take just a minute and talk about some interesting science news. This will be an abbreviated portion of our program compared to what we typically do in our bi-weekly YouTube program. A couple of news stories that caught my attention. One was scientists have cracked a mystery about how cells regulate their own size. And it seems to be that there's a diffusion of a particular molecule within the cell. And as the density decreases because the size of the cell increases, that triggers the cell to stop growing and to initiate potentially other functions, whether that's cell division, etc. But the way that a cell keeps track of its physical size is by measuring its own density and the dispersion of this chemical that is tied to that density. I found that very intriguing. There
was one detail that I saw in that, and that is that the amount of that chemical immediately after cell division is related to how much DNA there is. It comes bound to the DNA and then it disperses. And that's why there is only a given amount of it, is that when the cell divides, it attaches this chemical to the DNA. That measures how much DNA you've got. You make two cells. Now each one of them has a defined amount of that chemical. And then as it grows, the chemical, chemical gets diluted, and that determines how big it's allowed to grow.
Fascinating stuff. Microbiology and cellular biology and biochemistry. You know what? Physicists have it easy. That microbiology and whatnot, that's just some of the most complicated things in the known universe, I think. Now, talking about the intersection of science and humanism, recently there was an interesting report that came out where some scientists went back and looked at some predictions made by climate contrarians or climate change skeptics. And, 10, 20 years ago, some of these climate change skeptics said, no. The Earth isn't going to warm by such and such, 1.5 degrees centigrade. And, we're not going to have to worry about, forest fires becoming more prominent and droughts becoming more severe and whatnot. Here's what we predict. We predict that it'll cool off or that it'll reach some plateau. Well, enough time has elapsed since some of those predictions were made that those predictions can be evaluated, and the jury is in, as it were. And the conclusion is that those climate contrarians were mistaken. Now, that's not necessarily good news. right? I mean, sure, it's fun for all of us to think that we're right, but it's not so fun to be living in a world that is undergoing such significant climate alteration. So it's a regular part of science to have some scientists disagree with other scientists. But when the consensus is whatever it is these days, 99.8% or 98% of professional climate scientists say that this is really happening and we got to watch out for it. You got to have a really good case and a lot of data to back up a contrary opinion. So any of our panelists have any thoughts about that story before we move on?
Well, I think there's a tendency for news media to like something controversial, make it more interesting. So even though maybe 99 out of 100 climate scientists say that this is really happening and it's really human driven, the media will say, but on the other hand, there's this climate scientist who denies it. He's 1 out of 99 or 1 out of 99 out of 99. I don't know, but that gives them a more interesting story.
Yeah,
So,
false equivalency.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
you know, one of my favorite contrarians was the astrophysicist Thomas Gold, who was almost always wrong, but every once in a while was spectacularly right. And I appreciate his work because of the spectacularly right. The way, and such people make big contributions to science because we test their hypotheses and we throw out the ones that are bad and we keep the ones that are good.
And if we look at the recent IPCC data, it's just horrific what they're looking at. In the next 20 to 30 years, we're looking at a condition on the planet which is going to be very traumatic for most species. And I hate to say it, but have we gone beyond the tipping point?
Yeah.
I'm wondering. It would appear, at least to me, that we have done so. That the disaster is in place. We're going to hit 2.5 degrees, at least.
Well,
Yeah.
even if it's 1.5 degrees, it's not going back to where it was, because even 1.5 degrees is a major effect, right?
Oh, huge.
Even 1 degree, and you have areas that are exponentially growing once you started them. So it's
And
not
they're
going back
talking
to where it was.
And they're talking about the Gulf Stream stopping. And if so, Europe is going to be in a disastrous state. As we know, it could be 10 to 20 degrees centigrade difference between the Gulf Stream operating and the Gulf Stream not operating. And that could mean crop failures, ice age, starvation for 1 billion people. It'd be a disaster on a worldwide scale.
Yeah. All right, so let's stop
That cheery note.
on that cheery note. Thanks, Joanne. Those of you who have joined us late, one more, I might do this once more before we finish our program tonight after this, but those of you who have joined late, we are a group of scientists and science communicators, and we have a regular bi-weekly, usually it's twice a month, whether or not it ends up being every 2 weeks, it's twice a month program about science and the intersection of science and humanism. You can find out more about our program on Meetup at if you search for Prairie State Humanists. So without further ado, let's move on to today's deep dive subject. And by the luck of the draw, I ended up being the person to select the deep dive subject. I came up in the agenda. We each take a turn with a deep dive subject, and my deep dive subject for today is the subject of UFOs and maybe even aliens. So this is a little thing that I wrote up this afternoon. I can usually do a little better putting my thoughts together writing than speaking extemporaneously. So I'm going to read this to you, and then we'll have some of our panelists, if not all of them, give some of their thoughts and maybe some of a little bit of prepared remarks that they have, and then we'll take questions. Once, every decade or so, news sources and not a few government and military folks, they become breathlessly enthusiastic about the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena. what used to be called UFOs, or sometimes the particularly evocative LGM, little green men. Recently, there have been a spate of news stories about these events, discerned from fuzzy film sequences or chatter between fighter pilots, some firsthand accounts, or a strange interplanetary object that flitted through the solar system a couple of years ago. And the subsequent speculations of an esteemed Harvard astronomy professor and former department chair, R.V. Loeb. Now, before we all jump to conclusions, I believe it's Avi Loeb, by the way, I think I mispronounced his name. Now, before we all jump to conclusions, which I'll come around to the conclusion jumpers in a moment, let's recognize that the name unidentified aerial phenomena is loaded with subtle meaning. It means that there were events or objects seen in the air. Let's call these phenomena. And these things, which come in various sizes and durations and configurations, were unidentified. They were unidentified aerial phenomena. Very subtle points there. Now, for those of you who are choosy about your unidentified aerial phenomena, is not to put too fine a point on it, the fact that they're unidentified makes them some of the most interesting things, the interesting phenomena that we've observed. Now that's it. That's all this means. They're just unidentified things that happen in the air. You know, the US military and other sober commentators encourage us all not to draw extraordinary conclusions from scanty evidence and snippets of video. All sorts of possible causes, from atmospheric or optical effects to human-made balloons or drones, are possible causes. Missiles could also be behind some of the phenomena. In many cases, there just isn't enough evidence to either rule something in or rule it out. Thus, they remain unidentified. They're splotches on a recording or bleeps on a radar, and so on. Now, this doesn't mean that they aren't variously and really interesting, disconcerting, or possibly even extraordinary. What it means is we don't know. Now, there are lots of things we as a species don't know. We don't know what causes ball lightning, or how quantum mechanics and gravity meld together, or why the corona of the sun is millions of degrees hotter than its photosphere. And don't get us started on the whole dark matter, dark energy thing. The secular, scientific, and humanist communities have a great deal of overlap, philosophically and dispositionally speaking. Several scientific skeptics, for instance, have put a lot of effort into analyzing the recent UAP film footage. I strongly recommend, for example, the YouTube channel run by Mick West. He's got a whole series of videos about these phenomena where he takes a critical, skeptical, scientific eye to some of the available evidence. He does a delightful job of explaining how infrared images, especially overexposed ones, can look like fuzzy blobs to the untrained eye and the trained eye. And most of the footage we've all seen has been from infrared, not optical cameras. He also has done some wickedly cool geometry and trigonometry for us to make the plausible case that some objects we might naively think are moving at supersonic speeds are really moving at speeds that a balloon would move at when just floating along in an air current. He's also talked about out of focus lenses creating triangle-shaped blurs of brightness around unfocused lights, maybe the lights on an airplane. There's more he's done, and I recommend his videos for those of you wanting to delve more deeply into the science and engineering specifics of plausible, mundane explanations. Again, his YouTube can be found by searching for Mick West. Another point that Mr. West and others have made is that fighter pilots are highly trained professionals. They're trained to be cool under stress, and they're masters of the flight and weapons control systems on their aircraft. What they may not be is masters of immediately done back of the envelope trigonometry, digital signal processing, optical engineering, and possibly even masters of critical thinking and science. There's a lot that any given person, even an expert in a particular field, doesn't know. Now, certain armchair commentators and viewers of unidentified aerial phenomena, the viewers of the recordings, might decide that these are largely the work of little green men or ET. Now, these are folks who have jumped to an extraordinary conclusion. Now, quickly, here's some food for thought about that. Meteors are hunks of matter that burn up when they hit the Earth's atmosphere because they're moving so fast and the friction causes a lot of heat. One of the fastest airplanes ever built, the SR-71 spy plane, had big gaps in the metal sheets covering its wings so that when it got up to speed at Mach 3.5, the heat from the atmospheric friction caused the metal to expand and seal up. Things that move very quickly through the atmosphere get very hot. The military has made a vehicle that can briefly attain Mach 9.6, or nearly 7,000 miles an hour. It exhausts a huge heat plume and burns through a tremendous amount of fuel to reach these speeds in a non-ballistic trajectory. Such machines shake, rattle, and roar, and their arc through the atmosphere is anything but subtle. When we think about the initiative to go to Mars, we give the projects and the rockets we build names like Starshoot or the SpaceX Starship. Now, this is highly misleading. These aren't between the stars ships. They're hardly even one-star system ships. Nobody has yet figured out how to get to Mars and back safely, much less another star carrying a human cargo. The trip of ferrying humans to Mars is envisioned to take about a year. Mars is about 14 light minutes away. That means that anything whizzing through space at the speed of light will take that long to get from here to there. Now, 14 minutes is much less than a year that a rocket would take, but it's a speed that is literally inconceivable for any rocket ship. The closest star is nearly 150,000 times more distant. That's just the closest star. And there's essentially zero chance that it hosts an advanced civilization because it's not got the right kind of star to host hospitable planets. Space is unimaginably big and unimaginably empty. You know, we can write down numbers to explain such things, but I think getting a real feel for it is nearly impossible. For example, it takes a light beam about 4 years to get from here to the nearest star. At the literally blistering human speed of up to 7,000 miles per hour for that fast ship I was talking about, maybe you think it would take, a bit over 4 years to get to the nearest star if we could go 7,000 miles per hour. No, you'd better pack a lot of snacks and reading material because it would take 400,000 years of poking along through nothingness to get just to the nearest star. And that's about as long as the human race has existed. If you were to hop on a spaceship and somehow try to travel at nearly the speed of light, well, you'd run into problems. At about 20% the speed of light, And certainly as one goes faster than that, interstellar dust grains would become lethal bombs, shredding any known material made from any of the 96 or so elements available for building things in our universe. At that speed, you and your spaceship would be burned up like a meteor by the rarefied atmosphere of outer space. The same goes for any other civilization that, also limited to the only elements the universe manufactures, would aspire to interstellar voyages. I'll only mention in passing the problems with figuring out how to make a propulsion system that can fling you between the stars and take you on a jaunty little sprint through the atmosphere of a planet once you've reached another star. And magnetism won't do it. Chemical propulsion won't do it. And frankly, once you get beyond chemistry and electromagnetism, you're pretty much out of options as far as the laws of nature are concerned. Some of you may be thinking about gravity and wormholes, but cutting to the chase, I can tell you those won't work either. There are profound barriers to interstellar travel. I just had my trusty central air conditioner replaced. Motor bearings, rubber seals, and whatnot had degraded over the past 20 years. Imagine trying to make a motor or a toaster oven or a microwave or an elevator or even a door hinge that could last for thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. Wear and tear tears everything apart eventually. And there's a heap of time for eventualities in any conceivable interstellar journey. There's also boredom, assuming we can figure out, immortality to live long enough to take the journey. But we'd also probably need food and thousands of other practical considerations. And practicalities are vitally important when preparing for a journey where it's only you and whatever you can cram into your flying saucer. I mean, who's ever heard of a 60 trillion mile, 400,000 year warranty? They don't exist. Okay, let's talk about the little green sentient beings that might be out there in the cosmos somewhere. I think Abby is going to talk more about this in a moment, so I won't talk much about the plausible biological similarities such as brains and manipulating digits and mouths and eyes and so on. Let me state my general opinion about extraterrestrial life. I think a great argument can and has been made that simple life is very plausibly common in the cosmos. However, I think the chances that intelligent life has evolved as us or more technologically advanced could occur on a planet close enough to us to be relevant, those chances are minuscule at best. The chance that they've evolved on a relatively nearby planet and visited us is even less plausible. But I can't categorically dismiss it as scientific impossibility. We know that space is traversable, even if very slowly, and we know that intelligent beings can exist, even if we're the only sample data point. But what I want you to think about is why such beings, if they exist, would want to come all the way to our planet to play cat and mouse with military aircraft or have late night assignations with rural farmers. Also, why would they have the seeming agenda of leaving vague, fuzzy, questionable evidence? If they're remarkable enough to travel the stars, they're competent enough to stay off our radar, so to speak. If a civilization so advanced that they have the energy, lifespans, and technology necessary to cruise the galaxy, well, we have nothing practically to conceivably offer them. What would we have that they'd be interested in if they have the galaxy at their doorstep? water, diamonds, gold, iron, and silicon. These are all abundant in the universe. So it's not likely that they would be here for any kind of raw material. If you think they're here to test the target acquisition and maneuverability of our 4th and 5th generation fighter jets, well, ask yourself why. If they're so advanced they can navigate the galaxy, I find it hard to believe they're worried about our air-to-air missiles or lead bullets flying toward them at relative snail's pace. If you take the anthropological view and suppose they're here just out of curiosity, then why spy on farmers and fighter jets? It'd be like Jane Goodall spending a lifetime just to investigate the rocks that some chimps use to crush seeds. I can see some merit in the anthropological curiosity hypothesis, but if that's the case, it seems likely they'd either try to be super secretive and succeed, or they wouldn't be shy about getting our attention. If they want to be secretive, well, they're screwing that up. If they want to get our attention, then I don't know, heck, land on Harvard Yard with a solution to Fermat's last theorem or the blueprints for a machine to remove excess CO2 from the atmosphere, or even just pretty close-up pictures of a neutron star. If there are little green men jaunting about in our skies, then somebody, somewhere on Earth should be able to use a good digital camera to make a good high-resolution record of their shenanigans. We've had so many out-of-focused, overexposed, shaky images. Can we get a Steadicam on the job? For now, it seems most appropriate to shrug our shoulders and recognize that we cannot, in fact, draw many conclusions from the extant evidence. Thus, we can rightly categorize these as unidentified, but not likely alien. It's enough to make a person think the problem of identifying these things might largely derive from the inherent difficulty of drawing sound conclusions from very noisy data. To paraphrase a recent argument made by Professor Loeb, show me a high-resolution image or video of a flying saucer with "Made in Orion" stamped on its hull, and then we'll have ourselves a more substantive mystery. Right, so that's some of what I have to think about this question of unidentified aerial phenomena and a hypothesized connection to little green men. Typically at this point in our programs, we do a discussion amongst our panelists about the topic in question, and we take questions from the audience. But we've modified it a little bit today to make sure that our panelists have time to speak before we start addressing questions. So I'm going to turn this over to Joanne next, and I think she's got a couple of points that she wants to make about mysterious objects on Earth, but not necessarily ones that fly through the sky. So Joanne, you want to talk to us for a minute?
Yeah, let me get my share screen going here. And we're going to pull up a doohickey. And away we go. Hopefully. And can everyone see that?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, I'm going to do my little slideshow. And one of these is going to work, right? Oh, here we go. Scott was talking about the big philosophical stuff, and I decided to go back into the history and look at artifacts and find out if ancient artifacts actually exist, and if they do exist, where, and are they convincing? And of course, I immediately came upon this little critter, and I looked at it and I said, this makes really no sense. It is not a costume that anyone could wear. It doesn't represent any particular civilization. But what does it look like? It's a sculpted figure from the Middle East. There's no clothes or costume of any civilization in that area. There's no religious or ceremonial connection. And so I said, what does it look like? And I came up with Neil Armstrong's suit that he wore on the moon. And the comparison is striking. Similarly, we look at this particular figure on the left, and what do we see? Do we not see a astronaut or cosmonaut out on a spacewalk? Well, it sure looks it, doesn't it? And these are Mayan sculptures. What do they look like, if not the Mercury capsule that John Glenn and Alan Shepard flew so successfully in? Are these not men from outer space? Are these not space suits? Do we not see a correlation? And again, we can get them from all over the world, from the Far East, from Mesoamerica, from the Middle East. And we just have to ask ourselves, and I say, I do not explain, I only ask, what are these? What do they represent? Why do they seem to emulate figures from our present day space program? And I just put up a big question mark saying, I don't know. And I leave that up to everyone else. So that's me.
Thank you, Joanne. More unexplained phenomena, this time usually represented in clay or stone. All right, I believe, Abby, you had some thoughts about possible alien physiology that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I teach human anatomy and physiology. And as I said, I've got a degree in zoology. And well, I'm reminded of a line in one of my favorite poems that goes, "It was the eager wish to soar that gave the gods their wings." And I interpret this as meaning that we humans wanted to fly. And so we projected that ability onto our imaginary beings. So we put wings on angels. We put wings on other supernatural beings because we wanted to fly. And I think we want to explore outer space. We're an exploring species. We've traveled all over the world, sometimes in very rickety little boats, and walked all over the world. We love to explore. We can't explore space. We can't even fly without a lot of mechanical help. So we invented imaginary beings to explore space because we want to. How do I know that we invented these beings? Now we're getting into biology. I've read lots of descriptions of aliens written by folks who claim to have seen them. And these aliens are nearly always, pay attention here, bilaterally symmetrical, bipedal tetrapods. They are human-shaped with 2 legs that they walk on, 2 arms with hands at the ends, a torso in the middle, and a head at the top with 2 eyes. Exactly 2. Their bodies are shaped like human bodies. It's boring, frankly. At least when I was a child, descriptions of aliens included antennas on top of their heads, but not anymore. Those poor aliens have been deprived of even that one interesting feature. So let's think about eyes for a moment. Why only 2? Spiders have 8 eyes, sometimes even 12. Flies have 5 eyes, those 2 big compound eyes that are easy for us to recognize, and 3 simple eyes between those 2 big ones. Bees have this as well. Horseshoe crabs have 10 eyes distributed all over their bodies, and scallops have around 200. Let's look at appendages. Spiders have 8 legs. Octopuses have 8 arms, and squid have 10. Jellyfish may have 4 or 8 or hundreds of tentacles. Insects have 6 legs, crabs have 10, pill bugs, which are crustaceans, have 14, and centipedes have 10 to 300 legs. Why do the aliens always have 2? As to body types, jellyfish are radially symmetrical, meaning they are symmetrical around a point. So you will have a circle around a point. That's how jellyfish are organized. It's how starfish are organized and the like. So they're symmetrical. Meanwhile, as I said, jellyfish are symmetrical around a point. They're radially symmetrical. On the other hand, we are bilaterally symmetrical, so we have mirror images on either side of an imaginary line down our middle. Jellyfish bodies, on the other hand, also don't have segments. Spiders are bilaterally symmetrical and have 2 body segments, like us. Insects have 3 body segments, and pill bugs have 14. My point is that animals on Earth, right here, have this wonderful variety of body types and numbers of eyes and numbers of limbs. Yet all those aliens from all over the universe have bodies with exactly the same symmetry, the same number of body segments, limbs, and eyes as us. Really? I mean, let's face it, those so-called aliens are the product of the human imagination. And I've got to say, it's a pretty boring imagination at that. So that's sort of my little spiel on how it is that we invented the aliens. And I think that's actually pretty good evidence for the idea that those aliens are the products of our own imagination.
Fantastic. Thank you, Abby. Ivan, that sounds like something that's kind of right up your alley in terms of, drawing conclusions from limited data, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many different thoughts about this topic. I've long been interested in transhumanism, and in transhumanism, we think about upgrading humans and also seeing non-human life as having value and personhood and so on. Well, one of the ways of upgrading humans is to turn them into machines. I mean, we're already biological machines, but you could, if the human brain was running at the speed of a silicon computer instead of the biological, it might run 1,000,000 times faster. So, but the other thing is that if a machine, if you were to, like, how could we populate another planet or even reach another planet? What if we were to send like 1,000 soup can sized self-replicating robots in the hopes that one of them actually touches down at the destination and then beam, with radiation, our intelligence into that, right? So the idea that aliens would be squishy life forms like us is something that it's not obviously likely to be the case. But in terms of interpreting this evidence, I think that the problem is the problem with the aliens explanation is not that it's impossible. Like we can always come up with a story in which the aliens want to come here to do something. But then we can tune that story to meet what limited evidence we have. The real question is this situation really mirrors the intelligent design situation. Right. The question is, like, as you were asking, Scott, why would they come here to play cat and mouse with a jet fighter, for example? But a better way of looking at it is not asking why this one thing, but why not all the other things, all the other possible things. In other words, if you were to write down a general theory of what aliens would do, it wouldn't really predict anything specific. There are 1 billion different purposes they could come here with, and 1 billion different ways they could appear to us. And only a very small minority of those look like what has been observed. The other thing that occurred to me as we were talking as you were giving your presentation is, what if we knew that there was alien life 100 light years away? And then we look at our UFO reports. How much more confident would we be that these reports were aliens if we knew aliens actually existed 100 light years away? And I think the answer is, we wouldn't be that much more confident. We would be more confident that there's intelligent life in our galaxy because we could maybe receive some signals from it. But then again, we'd be left with, well, if the aliens did come here, would they look like what we have observed? And I think that's the weak aspect of the evidence, is what we're trying to do. We're trying to explain the unknown with something even more unknown, which is what are the aliens? What do they look like? What would they come here for? And if you could show that it was impossible for the data to be the way it was without aliens, then you'd have a compelling argument. But we don't really know the data well enough to say this isn't something atmospheric, or this isn't a flaw in, you know, forward-looking infrared on a jet plane. So that's my take on it. I think, but then, you know, that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be investigating this.
Right.
If this is something that distracts pilots, we ought to know about it. You know, if this is a defect in a, you know, fighter jet tracking system, yeah, we better investigate that and find out what's going on.
Yeah, if a bug crawls along the lens of a tracking camera in a fighter jet at 30,000 feet, you know, if a tiny little mite is crawling across the lens and maybe leaving an infrared signature on the recording, is that something the military needs to start taking into account in training their pilots or building more bug-proof cameras, for example? Great points. Thank you, Ivan. John, I know that you are an astrophysicist and you look out at space a lot. What are your thoughts about this topic?
Well, in 1952, when the term UFO was invented, we knew about 2,000 asteroids. We now know about over 1 million. We had theoretical ideas about neutron stars and black holes, and we believed they would never be observed. We had no idea what radio galaxies were. We hadn't discovered quasars, pulsars. By the way, pulsars were originally known as LGMs because as a bit of a joke, but they did seem organized and intelligent very briefly, but now we're quite sure they're a natural phenomenon. The amount of surveillance that we've been putting on the universe has increased by a huge amount. And then also the atmospheric scientists have been surveilling things. And in fact, they found some things that pilots had reported that people that they hadn't believed, this upward lightning, these things called sprites and elves, unusual aurorae, a bunch of things that we didn't know about in 1952. And that's all very exciting. We as scientists are always on the lookout for odd things, new things, unusual things. But the thing that has not happened is that these things that some people think are alien spaceships, despite this tremendous improvement in the quality and the quantity of their surveillance, these things have never come into focus as alien spaceships. Now, they're always going to be out at the edge of the capabilities of the cameras and the other instrumentation, lousy images, blurry things, puzzles. And there's some things that we're still puzzling about. There's Boyagin's star, which some people think is an alien macrostructure or occulting a star. The problem with that is that there's no infrared coming out of it. So if you're going to intercept, if you're going to do, you know, the Dyson sphere thing of intercepting a lot of the energy from your star to get energy for your civilization, you're going to have to radiate the heat away somewhere. And it doesn't, there's no infrared signature that we can detect. That also constrains natural explanations, but the difficulties of the natural explanations and the difficulties of the technological, you know, explanation are the same difficulties. And so I think, you know, it will turn out to be that it's something, it's some distant disk around the star that's periodically causing it to dim. And then there, you alluded to Oumuamua, the extra solar comet or asteroid or whatever you want to call it, that entered the solar system and has a very strange surface and a very odd shape, and also accelerated very slightly on its way out without apparently using any reaction mass. But there are pretty mundane explanations for that. If you smashed Pluto into splinters, the splinters of the ocean would probably look like Oumuamua, and they might behave like that because they're made out of nitrogen, and you wouldn't detect nitrogen outgassing from such a thing and causing it to accelerate a little bit. So again, there seems to be a prosaic explanation there. Don't tell me that astronomers are not excited by odd things, because that's what we live for. We look for them. We love to falsify our own assumptions. When I was working on gamma ray bursts, I thought the hypernovae hypothesis was daft, and I wound up helping to prove it. So, you know, that was the high point of my career. But we just haven't found anything in those 69 years that would cause us to seek, you know, into extraterrestrial intelligence as the explanation for these blurs. That's how it is.
Thanks, John. Very insightful, and a great perspective to add. Mike, you've been studying physics for a lifetime. You know what the forces of nature are and how to accelerate things to high speed and whatnot. I don't know if any of that expertise you can bring to bear on the question, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts regardless. You're on mute, Mike, by the way. You'll have to. Yeah.
I can do it. Okay,
There
fine.
you
Thank you very much. So yeah, to start with, of course, I'm quite prepared to believe that in our galaxy with its hundreds of millions of planets, there's life out there. But what I would say, and I'm talking about energetics and well-established physics, whatever these unidentified things are, and they're unidentified, so I'm not saying what they are, but they are definitely not spaceships from civilizations on other planets. And I'm not putting myself out there, but I'm saying they're definitely not. I'm certain of that, as I am certain that you cannot just float a yard above the ground with no visible or even invisible means of support. We have extremely well-tested theories that relate space and time, which is special relativity, and gravitation, which is general relativity. And by theory, I don't mean just a theory. I mean an accurate description of how matter can move with calculations that have agreed with measurements for over 100 years. And your GPS relies on it, by the way. So now, according to relativity, no matter can be accelerated up to the speed of light. And it takes an enormous amount of energy to even get within spitting distance of it, even half the speed of light. I'll come back to that energetics in a minute. Now, the fastest thing we've ever sent out in space is the Voyager 1 spacecraft. Now, it's 14.2 billion miles away. It seems a long way away. It's traveling at 38,000 miles per hour. 38,000 miles per hour. That's a hell of a speed. It's actually only 0.0056% the speed of light. And it was using slingshots by Jupiter and Saturn to gain speed. It didn't take all that fuel with it to get up to that speed. for that Pioneer, that Voyager 1 spacecraft at 38,000 miles per hour, it would take about 76,000 years to get to the nearest star. 76,000 years, that's Proxima Centauri. Now, there may be alien civilizations even in the galaxy, but the chance that they're within even 100 light years is minuscule. And I don't say much about antimatter rocket fuel. I mean, people talk about that crazy thing. At Fermilab, we made more antimatter, antiprotons than anywhere else. We're making 10 trillion a year antiprotons. Had we been able to collect those all together and use them to make energy by annihilating them, we could have lit up a 30-watt bulb for about 5 minutes. Okay, that's the amount of energy. You need a lot of, so, and there are no antimatter wells. And as far as the shortcuts through wormholes in space-time, there may be wormholes in space-time, but if they exist, they're at the Planck scale, which is 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. Can I share my screen? Because I've got a slide with some
Sure.
stuff on. I can share my screen. Now, this is it's a very physicsy. You've disabled participant share screening. Can you allow me to share screen? Or maybe, I don't know. Maybe I can't.
I don't know if I can give you the permission. Maybe our host at the AHA can give you permission to share.
Oh, I'm the
I
co-host.
have now made you a co-host, so go ahead and please share your screen.
All right, and I apologize in advance for having lots of equations on here. I'm told that they will always lose people straight away. But can you see this? Can you see this slide here?
Yes.
Okay, so this is about energetics. All right, everybody knows E is mc squared. Wonderful equation, but that equation is not true in general. It's only true for an object at rest. When an object is moving, it has some momentum if it's got mass. And the true equation, more general, is here E squared is p squared c squared plus m squared c to the fourth. C is the speed of light, okay. And p is momentum, E is the energy, and m is the mass at rest of the object. Now, and we use a quantity called beta, the Greek letter beta, to describe the speed in terms of the speed of light. And beta is between 0, an object at rest, or 1, an object with the speed of light. And it's given by the momentum divided by the energy. And there's an equation for the total energy, which is mc squared, you know and love that, but divided by the square root of 1 minus beta squared. Now, you'll see if you put beta equals to 0, like you're at rest with no speed, it's E is mc squared. But this equation blows up, becomes infinite if beta tends to 1. So no matter particle can get to the speed of light. It's got a rest mass. Now, at CERN, we have the highest energy particle collider in the world. We accelerate those protons until their energy is 7,000 times their rest mass, and they're going at 0.999999 C. If you give more and more energy, you just add 9s to that. You don't get up to the speed of light for any particle with mass. Now, so okay, but maybe a spaceship could go at half the speed of light and get to the nearest star in 8 years instead of 4. Okay, so then beta is 0.5. Now that factor, which multiplies the energy at rest of mc squared, that factor's 0.155. It doesn't seem very big, but that is what's multiplying the rest mass of the particle. Now I've just put in here, try to think of some spacecraft. I mean, we're talking about spacecraft here. The lightest one I can imagine really is something like the mass of a Mini Cooper, a small car with one person in it. Forget about the food, just a car and one person. That mass is about 1.5 tons, 1.5 10 to the 3 kilograms. Now you plug that in with C is the speed of light, which is 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. And you find the kinetic energy. The kinetic energy of that little spacecraft is 2 times 10 to the 19 watt seconds, that's joules. Now, how does that, where do we get that energy from? We can't get it from solar sailing because that dies out as soon as you get away from a star. We can't get it from planetary slingshots because they're going much, much slower than the speed of light. To compare that number, all the power stations in the USA, for 1 year, if you collected all their energy that they're generating for 1 year, you get about the kinetic energy of that little spacecraft. So clearly you can't put that sort of energy a year's worth of all the power stations in the United States. And if you want to go at like 0.5 or 0.6 the speed of light, 0.7 or 0.8 speed of light, you need all the power stations in the whole world for a whole year, collecting all the energy and somehow giving that onto the spacecraft. And of course, that energy itself has got mass, so it's a bit more complicated than that. But I'm saying that here, and I'm prepared. So we know this theory is correct at that level. I mean, it's been tested. We've discovered, predicted gravity waves from merging black holes and so on. So the bottom line is, according to relativity, which is very well established, the kinetic energy of a 1.5-ton spaceship at half light speed will be the total power output of all the USA power station for 1 year. Now, as we've said before, the chance that, that there's life on Earth, that life on other planets somewhere out in the galaxy is high. Life that would be interested in or able to make spaceships and travel to other stars within even 100 light years is minuscule, not zero, but minuscule. And of course, this little calculation assumes no mass for the fuel, no mass for food, just the basic Mini Cooper flying in space with one passenger in it, one passenger that's not too heavy, the passenger, okay. So the energy must come from outside, and I know no way it can come from outside. Having said that,
what if you replace that with like a Tesla, that has all those batteries? It's probably a little heavier than the Mini Cooper. Would that be able to get us to the nearest star?
No, and nothing. I mean, I think if we want to send humanity to stars around other planets, probably, okay, you can send robots, of course, because maybe you don't care if they live or die, and you can make many of them, and you can invent robots that will make more robots, so the robots will self-multiply. Or you can imagine sending little tiny spaceships with a fertilized human egg in, with instructions on how to find a nearby planet that looks like Earth, and then that's sending a thing that a 1 gram or 10 gram spacecraft that you're allowed to send thousands of them out into space. We'll never know, of course, if they reach there or not. So it doesn't seem too much point. But anyway,
all kinds of science fiction, extraordinary science fiction ideas are possible even with known science. So that concludes this. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I'm just reading. So having written that, so I'm now reading a great science fiction book. Actually, it's called Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. He's the guy who wrote the story of The Martian, which became a very good movie, actually. And this is really good. The protagonist is a science teacher. And actually, what they've discovered is things called astrophages, which are tiny creatures like viruses, but they live on the sun, and they are able to suck the energy of the sun and basically turn their little tiny mass into energy. And anyway, it's a great story. I've only read half of it so far, but I recommend this story. And so, right.
Thank you, Mike. All right. So that concludes our deep dive portion of the program. We have about 20 minutes, a little more than 20 minutes, perhaps, left for Q&A sessions. So do we have any questions from our viewers?
We do. The first question that showed up in the chat: would some of the effects of Gulf Stream stopping be mitigated by the overall warming of the oceans? I think that's for you, Joanne.
From what I have read, and again, I am not a meteorologist, I have no degree in that kind of a field, but from what I have read, no, it would not. That is, the Gulf Stream, of course, is a huge river. It's in one of the largest rivers on the planet, and it's taking all of the heat energy from the equator and moving it up across the ocean to the northern latitudes. And this is what keeps Britain and all of Europe nice and warm. As Mike Elbro has pointed out, there are palm trees in Scotland. Now, if you look on a map, Scotland is way up north. It's up north of Newfoundland. Now, you don't have palm trees in Newfoundland. You don't have them in northern Canada, but you do in Scotland. You have palm trees in Ireland. If you go up into Norway and Sweden, you have an extraordinarily temperate climate. If you take that temperature down by 10 degrees centigrade, all of a sudden, instead of having an 80-degree hot day in the summer, you have a 60-degree hot day, and a 20-degree below zero becomes 40 degrees below zero in either scale, obviously. And this becomes a tragedy. How do you grow crops? How do you survive as a civilization? How do you keep homes warm? This could be an extraordinary disaster if, furthermore, the Gulf Stream is only the start of a huge chain of events that goes around the world completely. It comes back down across the coast of Africa, comes up through the Indian Ocean into the Pacific Ocean, and back down again. This is an enormous train of water going around our entire planet. And if this part of it fails, then the whole thing begins to collapse. And now you have a worldwide disaster at the ocean level. Now, obviously, 70% of the planet is water. So if 70% of the planet is in deep trouble, what happens to the other 30%? That's us. So I perceive it as being a disaster.
Yeah, just comment. Yeah, the Gulf Stream has kept Britain temperate, given its northern latitude. It doesn't have to disappear. It just has to be shifted somewhat to miss. Yeah. But of course, the part of the world warmed by the Gulf Stream is a very small part of the global situation, right? So, and these currents are moving around and changing. So, it's obviously very complicated, but yeah.
There's a bunch of feedbacks too. So most of the CO2 that gets taken out of Earth's atmosphere happens through natural weathering of rock, not because of biological activity. So one of the things is, let's say that through some climate change process, Greenland loses its ice sheet. Well, if the Arctic warms up and suddenly there's more rain on the rock surface of Greenland, then that might remove some CO2. I'm not trying to say that that's an optimistic way to get out of the terrible consequences of climate change. But what I am trying to illuminate is that the number of feedback mechanisms between clouds and solid earth and different rock and terrain types and water absorption by the land and the salinity of the ocean and other gases in the atmosphere, those feedback loops are so incredibly complicated that it's really difficult to do what if scenarios with an unknown climate in the future.
So I want to make sure we try to get to, we've got 6 questions
Okay.
here. So this is kind of a comment, and I think you touched on this a little bit. I saw a documentary on these UFOs based on a Navy pilot accounts, but it was casually mentioned that these events suddenly become common after a major upgrade to the radar system on our fighter jets. Having worked for IBM for 32 years, my first question would be, has the radar software been fully tested to eliminate ghost images in an uncontrolled real-world environment? I think you made some jest about bugs and things, but so.
I don't know the specifics of the engineering of any of these systems. I think that the fellow that I alluded to in my main, the body of my talk, Mick West? He's got a lot of videos. I recommend that you check those out on YouTube. I believe that's been posted in the chat, Mr. West's YouTube channel, and he probably delves into those kinds of topics about the mechanical and other sensitivities of these various monitoring systems. Does any of our other panelists have other insights into the question?
I did want to say that, when they say, they observed an object that seems to be in one place, and then it zooms off at hypersonic speed and, goes miles in just a small fraction of a second. You talked about the amount of friction that would be involved and the amount of heating. But when I see things like that, I tend to think that that looks like an optical illusion, because optical illusions can appear to move in, supersonic or even superluminal, even faster than light fashion. So I think that these are really like interesting puzzles to solve. I just not optimistic that it's going to turn out to be something quite as fun as Star Trek fans like me would like it to be.
Thank you.
To Abby, just a real quick comment. Somebody had loved your book. You and Nathan Lance did good job showing how nature is messy. Do you have plans for a follow-up? A sequel would be nice.
Well, I thank people for the compliment. I'm not quite sure who Nathan Lance is. I have not written with that person. I have written 2 books, one of which came out a couple of years ago and one of which was a few years before that. I'm assuming they're now talking about The Not So Intelligent Designer, which is a book that I wrote indeed about just how messy nature is and not at all the product of intelligent design. And I am working on a book, it's still very much in the sort of sketching it out stage, on science denial, where I'm going to be using as bookends the Challenger disaster on the one hand and COVID-19 on the other hand, and looking at science denial in the United States and possibly elsewhere during that time. So that's what I'm going to be working on over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Abby. Now that not that I'm an expert, but in that Carl Sagan postulated that because of the nature of the beginning of the universe or this particular individual Big Bang, that it would be logical that life would evolve, not just on Earth, but in various places within the universe. That would imply that the laws of physics, evolution, etc., exist everywhere. That in the course of evolution, early evolution includes such things as worms, where a part can be amputated and grow back, that there's a capability in more specialized organism. The question I have may be, and I'm not sure if I'm using the right word, asking in terms of convergent evolution, that the evolution of alien species may be speculated on such things as the need for having hands, which would enable the development of an intelligent life through the use of tools, etc.
I have 2 very quick answers, and then we can ask our other panelists as well. One is every star, with very rare exceptions, every star in the universe emits visible light. And that's why we see them. Well, fortunately, our sun emits visible light too, and that helps justify the fact that natural selection has selected for those characteristics of our bodies and other bodies to be sensitive to the radiation emitted by a star. So if there are complex organisms around other stars, it's likely that they have something very much like eyes. Although the number, as Abby said earlier, the number of eyes is an open question. The second thing that I want to quickly address is this notion of complex life evolving. There's this concept of something called the Great Filter that might plausibly explain why we haven't detected signals from other civilizations in the galaxy or evidence of other civilizations. And there are books that have been written about hypotheses of this Great Filter related to something called the Fermi paradox. But very quickly, a very intriguing possibility for the Great Filter is that they'll jump from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms made out of what are called eukaryotic cells, which is a technical term that isn't really relevant to this point. But the jump from simple single-celled organisms to multi-celled complicated organisms, that jump took about 2 billion years of life's history on Earth before it happened. And it seems to have only happened once. So that seems to provide some evidence that getting beyond a simple bacteria-like organism to a complicated organism that could evolve into dinosaurs or even worms, that probability could be extremely low. But we don't know its exact numeric value because we don't have any other data besides what happened on Earth. But it might mean that the universe is full of bacteria, but rarely, very rarely populated by worms or dinosaurs, much less something analogous to a sentient being. Anybody else have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, if
Well-
I could, oh, go ahead, John.
What Carl Sagan didn't know is that planetary systems with the architecture of our planetary system are rare. Planets are extremely common in the world, in the universe, I should say.
Sorry.
I've got to, my wife's got to deal with the dog here. He's gotten upset. Planetary systems are extremely, there are a lot of planets around, but we found thousands of them. But what we find is that they are in planetary systems that don't resemble ours. And so the idea that there are lots of Earth-like planets out there seems not to be true. So I would not expect in these other systems where the planets tend to be bigger, they tend to be more interacting, which makes for a not very stable environment for life to develop. I think that the systems we're seeing are not like the Earth, do not contain planets like the Earth. And so I wouldn't expect convergent evolution to be in action because I think the environments are very different.
Well, I would like to take a bit of issue with that, John, because we know there's roughly, round numbers, 100,000 million planets, stars in our galaxy. And now we're finding that planets are common enough. There may be something like 100 billion planets in the galaxy. Now, even if only 1% of them have conditions right for life, that's still 1 billion planets in our galaxy with the conditions right for life. Now, I'm not saying whether life starts on these planets or not, but it seems to me not unlikely that there are millions of planets in our galaxy with life that has evolved. However, having said that, when we talk about technological civilizations, like ability to make a spaceship or something like that, that's a very different question, because on Earth, that's only been the case for the last 100, 150 years. Out of the 4 billion that Scott said life has been evolving on Earth, that means that if you stretch the time that life has been on Earth to a year, we've only been capable of sending airplanes up in the sky for the last 10 seconds or something like that. Very, very small. And we don't know how long such technological civilizations are going to last. I mean, it could be that it only lasts for a few hundred or a few thousand years before we do ourselves in. So the lifetime of a technological civilization is a total unknown. It may be relatively short, but anyway, even if there are 1 million planets in our galaxy with life, the chance that they're within 100 light years is very, very small.
Well,
Yeah,
we
I
don't know what the conditions for life are, and it may very well be, that there is life on things like the water worlds we're discovering, but their physical situation is very different, and so I wouldn't expect convergent evolution to produce, large multicellular beings like us. It's one thing to say that the conditions for life are common, and it's another thing to talk about the likelihood of, and again, it probably is true that the moon is very important, has been very important for establishing the conditions that led to our evolution. And it doesn't look like binary planets like that, because what we're in is almost a binary planet. The moon is almost a planetary size. Binary planets like that do not seem to be common. We don't see any. We don't see systems with the architecture of the solar system. It seems actually unlikely that the moon would form in a solar system which is as placid as ours, because we look at other planetary systems and they don't look as placid, and yet they don't have things like this. So I don't know. I think the evidence is growing that we live in a very unusual environment here. And I wouldn't put a lot of weight on the idea that convergent evolution is going to find the same solutions for life everywhere in the galaxy. I think that we live in a very special spot, and I would expect different solutions for different life on different planets.
One of
Okay.
our viewers said John said he recommends the book Rare Earth by Ward and Brownie. I've read that book as well, and I also recommend it. I want to point out to our viewers that this friendly disagreement that sometimes happens among our panelists is not uncommon, right? Especially for questions that don't have a clear scientific answer yet. This is a part of the way science works, is different hypotheses and friendly arguments about things that make it more or less likely. In the interest of time, do we have another question, Kristen?
Yeah, may I jump in here? My thought would be that it's the equation requires time. We've been on this little rock for 4.5 billion years to come to the life forms that we now know. Given that the universe is 14 billion years or so, would it be possible that at an earlier time, let's say 4 billion years ago or 6 billion years ago, a planetary system evolved and came through? So it's the time factor, I think, that we have to consider here. Is there a high civilization right now in our universe? Well, were there high civilizations, and will there be high civilizations? Well, I think the answer to that is probably yes. Now, the trying to get the two of them at the same time so that they begin to talk with each other, that's an entirely different situation. So I'm sort of looking at it and saying, given time, everything will happen. But this is also, John pointed out, given time, planets are going to do stupid things. They're going to move out. They're going to crash into one another. They're going to do all sorts of, so they do need a relatively stable environment, but there are a lot of relatively stable environments out there.
I'd like to put in a quick word on time as well, which is just keep watching the news as we find out more and more about when life began on Earth. Because if life began on Earth relatively quickly after it was possible for life to begin and continue on Earth, then I would say that raises the probability that there is at least life, as in self-replicating molecules, elsewhere. Basically, if life developed here very early, then that's at least some evidence that there may be life elsewhere. But that does not indicate a technological civilization. It doesn't even indicate the development of cells. There's some indication, I will say, there's some evidence that because cell membranes are kind of self-organizing, that developing a cell like a bacterium might not be that hard to do. In terms of other evolution, I will admit that the tetrapod body plan is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A parsimonious body plan. If you're going to move from water to land, it gets you there. But I will also point out that the sea land transition happened with arthropods, that is to say things like insects first. So as I said, I'm going to maintain that there are lots of possible body plans out there. I will go along with what the questioner asked, which is if you're going to have a technological civilization, you're going to have ways of manipulating things. And these things are mighty handy. So as I said, if
I think octopi can put us to shame.
well, and but the point is they've got appendages is what I'm getting at. You'd have to, if you're going to have a technological civilization, you don't just get to have brains, you need to have manipulating objects.
But tentacles would do just fine.
I would argue you would need fire too, and it's hard to have fires in oceans.
Yeah, there's that.
And whatnot.
Anyway, but so those are things to look for, I would say.
Having broken my thumb this summer, the disposable thing, I've realized how these appendages are really, really important. I will let you guys do one more question and then we're going to call it a night. And I just want to say thank you so much. This has been really fun to have you all, and I hope we can have you back. The last question, which is kind of related to the conversation that you were just having. What is your favorite answer to the so-called Fermi paradox? I hope I'm saying that correct. Mine is we are alone, practically speaking.
Yeah.
Who wants to take a stab at that?
Well, if I understand it, Fermi paradox is Fermi said, you know, if the galaxy is full of civilizations, why aren't they here, or why haven't we heard them?
Yeah, so it has to do with the diffusion rate, assuming that a technological civilization develops, and even if they move at subluminal speeds, you know, much slower than the speed of light, if they can send Mini Coopers to other stars, you can still say that within 1 million years or 2 million years, they should be all over the galaxy, certainly within 10 million years. And 10 million years is a tiny, tiny fraction of time compared to the lifetime of a star, for instance. So Fermi's question was, if there are star-faring civilizations that have learned how to spread out in the galaxy, where the heck are they? So who's got some speculation?
Yeah, I've got some comment on that, because if you live 100 light years away, you are now receiving radio emissions or TV emissions from the First World War, and you're going to think, I'm going to stay the hell away from that place. And and maybe, you know, this is a humanist association thing, but maybe God designed the galaxy so that we're far enough away from other planets that we wouldn't ever go meet.
Or the aliens that seeded the galaxy put the seeds far enough apart.
They will stay home. They're smart enough to not travel around the galaxy.
I have a couple of answers, my two favorite answers. But the first answer is the one that's been discussed, which is although life formed on Earth almost as soon as it possibly could have, the Earth was cool enough, it wasn't complex life. And then it took more than 1 billion years, maybe 2 billion years for it to, or more, to create multicellular life. So that's a big filter there. Like, you know, not all planets are habitable for that period of time. Then, as you say, like, well, how long do intelligent civilizations last? I like to be optimistic and think that some of them will last a long time. The only other, and this is just purely speculative, is let's suppose that, you know, I do send out these robotic machines to populate all my nearby planets, and then from there they spread out to their nearby planets and so on. And Fermi's argument was this only takes like 1 million, 2 million years. In that time, you will colonize the entire galaxy. But 2 million years is very short compared to 1 billion years. So if intelligent life did exist and could do this, then they should be everywhere. But how much would these civilizations that you plant diverge? How much would they, you know, what is the probability that they become hostile to you, right? Like,
Or each other.
Yeah, like the United States becoming hostile to Great Britain, for example. That might, I mean, we might be able to cook up a scenario like that would explain it. But I think the evolutionary one is a better argument.
So I want to, before we close, I want to put in another plug for our regular program that we do twice a month. We do Sidewalk Science, which is almost identical to what we've done here tonight. For more information, you can find us on meetup.com if you search for Prairie State Humanists. We have other science programs. We have the Prairie State Humanist YouTube channel, and we have the Sidewalk Science YouTube channel. I want to personally thank everybody who tuned in tonight to watch this. We've had a lot of fun.